and how to fit them in. I have a question here about the function of the thematic units. We use them along with the textbook, and we go with the textbook, the theme that's being provided, because they also give some extra grammar lessons within that textbook that we use. And then we match up the theme along with the textbook lessons. It's kind of 50-50. We do both, the textbook and the curriculum Francophone Experience. We use Té Branché. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That textbook already goes by theme for the most part, so we just match it up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint that I prepared with you. If you have any questions, please ask. I can stop, look at it, and discuss it with you. If I go too fast, ask me to slow down. So within this presentation, I really want to explain how and why I began creating the thematic units. And I want to tell you how I use them and show you how you can use them, either as a complete thematic unit or as individual activities that can go along with your textbook, for example. And then I want to give you some suggestions for supplemental lessons. And I have 3 of them that you can download from the notes section. The informational handout for how to meet the standards will need to be emailed to you if that's something that you want. We weren't able to get it into that folder there. So when you email at the end, you can request for the handout. And I'll show you what it is. So in the mid-2000s, I was talking with a coworker, and he said to me, oh, in 10 years, we'll no longer be teaching basic knowledge like dates and grammar rules. And so, of course, as a language teacher, I debated and said, you can't get rid of the grammar from the curriculum, and you have to have a base for something for everything. And I was so surprised when I realized that, okay, in 2012, our standards started changing. And like a lot of my coworkers, I was resistant to the change. I was concerned about not focusing on the grammar and what that was going to do to our program. And then as I began making these IPAs that we needed to for the language standards, I really felt like I had 3 full-time jobs. I was teaching, grading, and developing these new activities around authentic resources. Then I started understanding, okay, this is why we're doing it. I understand now in the 21st century, we don't need to know the exact rule because you can just look it up on your phone easily, or you don't need to know an exact date because that's something we can Google easily. So all of that started to come together, and I have that in there twice. It was like another job. So I started developing the IPA packs with Teachers Discovery, and that was getting the activities that we needed for the communication standards around something that was authentic. So we started doing that around 2016. And my big question, I guess, was, well, what are we teaching them to assess this communication. So I felt like there were missing formative assessments. We needed to teach them something. We needed to teach them the culture and the vocab and the grammar. We needed to teach them before we could do the IPA pack, this summative, where they're asking you to talk about something. We were missing kind of the meat of everything. So then in 2017, I started working with Teachers Discovery, and I kind of combined everything. So the new standards, along with the I can statements, essential question, UBDs, if you're not familiar with those, it's starting with the end in mind, Bloom's taxonomy, and Marzano 9 instructional strategies. I really took all of that information and tried to put it into one place that I knew that I would then be able to meet the standards and teach effectively. So with this one right now, the presentation, I'm going to talk about the monuments unit. And if you haven't done so, remember you can get the free activities. There are three. There's a speaking, a writing, and a reading activity that I'll show you how you can use them later in the presentation. Okay, so the first thing that I do when I start the new unit is I look at the possible activities. What do I want to do in my classroom? And I can go through them, and what is my objective? Do I want them to know all of this information right now? Do I want them to know a little bit here and there? Okay, I have to decide, do I want to include them in my curriculum as one complete unit, or divide them up with small units across the school year, for example? So with monuments, okay, I might do a couple a quarter, or all of them at the middle part of the school year. So I have here, you can start with activity 1 and then just continue in order from there. The activities are organized with the input activities. So those are your not interpersonal. Oh my goodness. Your reading, your viewing, and your listening activities. They need to come first so that your students have something to talk about. And then you have your speaking and writing activities. So if you start with activity 1 and move your way through the unit, you will be sure to have each step ready to go and preparing you for the next one. You can also compare it with your school calendar. I like to do this for example, I might not want to do 1, 2, 3, 4 in order. I might want to change it, because if I have an activity that I know is going to take 2 or 3 days, and it's only a 2 or 3 day week, it fits in there nicely. But if I have 2 or 3 days and the activity that I want to do is a longer activity, I would save that one for a different time. And that's what I have here. You can compare those activities. You might want to use resources 14, 15, and 16. Here's what I have shown. And you would want to take it and make it fit into your curriculum. Or you can also assign groups for something like this with the monuments. You can have groups present it to the class. You can give it a typical presentation, or complete something as homework, something where everybody's learning something differently. It's really whatever you want to do. So the big picture is you have to strive for philosophical answers to the essential questions. So in order to do that, we really need to use and recycle the teaching model, which I'll show you on the next slide here. It really allows you to make that movement from basic knowledge that I was talking about earlier, because you do need that basic knowledge, which is the memorization of vocab words and facts. And then you go into the interpretive and the higher order thinking skills. Before I go on to the next slide there, I want you to notice that I think it's very important for you to remember that you're giving or teaching the students the knowledge and facts, but when it gets to that higher order thinking skills, you're really teaching them how to think or analyze what you have, not what to. And I say that because sometimes in a textbook, I see the textbook answer and it's not what the student said, but the student's answer makes sense. It's okay. So I always tell them, well, it doesn't have to be exactly like what I would say or what I would do. We just want to make sure it's right for you from your perspective. All right, and then here's the system that you want to follow. You want to start, we have knowledge. That's your basic starting place. So that's where you can go from keyword recognition, and then you get into, how do I know they understood? Well, we can look at the supporting details. We can assess the main idea. And the higher you go in the thinking skills, you're now applying, okay, analyzing. So you can see the activities in the IPA style activities, they go in order from keyword recognition, where the activity is giving you the knowledge that you need to complete the rest of it. So after you know what words you have, then you're working on using those words to decode the reading or listening to identify the main idea. So then we have the guessing meaning from context. And as we continue through with organizational features, the author's purpose, inferences, or cultural comparisons, that really is where you get into those higher order thinking skills. That's one of our main objectives here. We really need them to start thinking beyond the classroom. So if you're looking at the essential questions, okay, well, what does culture do? How does the culture influence their celebrations? You want to keep them thinking about that as they go through the lessons, so that eventually they'll be able to answer that at the end in a conversation at the end of the unit. If you wanted to, you don't have to go through the questions at the end, but the essential questions really give everything a purpose. Okay. How do customs develop and continue through generations? Well, I don't need you to answer that question right now. I just need you to think about it. What might come next? This tends to be confusing, I suppose, for my students in the beginning. They're younger, they're 7th and 8th graders. I have to teach them what an essential question is. And I explain to them it's on every page, because you should always be thinking about that. It's not, we're doing something today just to get through today's activity. We're doing this so that we know some answers if we wanted to discuss monuments. And then if we're looking at, this is the second page of one of the activities, you can see with the supporting details, okay, they're gonna answer in English to show that they have understood. If you want though, you can change where it says in English to French. It depends on where you are, but you're identifying here with supporting details, you're identifying that they understood. That's what you're doing with that. And then if you move in, the next activity gets you to an inference activity and then comparing cultural perspectives. Once they have the knowledge, then they can talk about it or write about it. That's the higher order thinking skill. That's where you want to go. And with comparing cultural perspectives, I kind of struggled with answering in English or answering in French. And I can't tell you when to use each level. So I can't say in these 3 units, you're going to answer the questions in English, but then by the time we switch to a 4th or a 5th unit, we'll switch into French. Because I don't know when you are going to use these activities in your classroom. So you have to think about it for what makes sense to you. Okay? And sometimes I do, I'll change it and I'll say, I want you to do this in French. I know you can do this in French. You have to start with the interpretive activities. That's the input. It tells you, it gives you the vocab, it gives you the grammar, it gives you something to talk about. When you go through the unit, it'll start off with an interpretive, whether it be reading or listening or viewing. I typically like to start with reading so they can start to see the words and then they can go through and kind of get a feel for the new vocab words. Then I'll usually go from there to a listening or a viewing. Either one is fine. I find that viewing is a little easier for the students because they can see and they have that extra skill that they can use to help them interpret. And if I'm looking at the pop-up boxes, so we have pop-up grammar, but I also wanted to share facts or ideas or something to think about. You know, maybe we don't need an answer, but what would we think about? Why would we think about this? Why would we do this? Why would we want to do this? Okay. And I talk about cognates all the time. I find that the more I talk about it, the more the students understand that it's important to know them, because you can read and understand it and know it means the same thing. It's also important to know that they aren't going to sound the same. Sometimes the students get caught up on that. And I just remind them all the time, well, what are the cognates? Why are they there in this activity? What do we need to know about them? Why is it important to know that France has a cognate so we can use it later and know that we know that word without studying a bunch of new vocab words, if that makes sense. I hope I'm going okay and not too fast. Please stop me or ask if you have questions. The next activity here, this is still from the monuments activity. So you would see that you have the theme, which is beauty and aesthetics, and then the sub-theme here is architecture and monuments. When students do beauty and aesthetics, a lot of times we think of people, beautiful people, right? What's pretty. And they don't always think about architecture as an art. And it really is. It's beautiful and we should talk about it. Okay? Why? What makes it beautiful? Here, once again, they are looking at the essential questions. I tell them we're not answering the essential questions. Okay? We're not writing an answer, but you want to have that in your mind. And then you'll see this one was interpretive viewing and then presentational writing. And The viewing, once again, gives us something to talk about. That's our input. But then once we have that information, we should be able to do something with it. And that's where, in this case, the presentational writing goes along with it. So we have the viewing, we'll gain that information, and then we'll write about it. If you follow the directions. But it's also important to note, if in your class it's better to do this as a speaking activity, then you can do it as a speaking activity. The units and the activities are flexible based on your needs. Okay, I have some notes here I made for myself so I wouldn't forget. So give me 1 second. I'll do something. All right. So if I'm looking at the unit as a whole, and I'm working on a couple of the activities in my curriculum, you don't have to do all of the activities at the same time. So for an example here with this lesson that I was looking at, our pop-up grammar is adjectives. Okay? We're talking about beauty and aesthetics. We need adjectives. So we learn vocab for the adjectives, we learn the grammar rules, the placement, the spelling. I might do all of that first, right in activity 1 with the description. And then I'll put that aside and we'll work on all of those words and grammar rules. We'll work on that for a day or two, maybe even, before going on to number 2, which is the comparisons. Well, that's a whole nother subset of skills. So I might need to then add some notes, some grammar, maybe how do you make a comparison, have an extra pop-up grammar level lesson, pardon me, where you're adding the vocab or the knowledge needed to make that comparison. And then after a few days, they can put all of that together and give opinions. Then they can use, I think this is beautiful, I think it's ugly, I think that this is prettier than, and really they're just putting it all together. Once you come to that place where you've put it all together, then you'll just circle back. You circle back, you start over, you give them some more information, you let them practice, give them grammar, and it starts all over again. And on this page, you can see where I made that note of, why does it say in English? Okay, well, you need to think about what you want them to do and make your adjustments if necessary. This activity now goes back to, you're giving your opinion, you're writing, this is the output. What can you say now that we have the vocab and the grammar and the culture, we have all of that now, we're going to have a presentational writing. Presentational just means that it's not back and forth dialogue. You could make this a presentational speaking. They are easy to switch up. You could turn it into an interpersonal writing if you would like, by having them write an email about their answers instead of a paragraph. And as my arrow here shows, before you give them this writing, you should think about, okay, if I need pop-up grammar, what have we already done? Adjectives. I want to focus on adjectives. And I want them to use the present tense. You have to set some criteria yourself as well. if that's what you want to assess. Ooh, that one's blurry. Within a unit, you might see very small activities such as this. You have multiple choice, maybe there are 5 of them. They're perfect for a quiz. You pull one out, you hand it out, you give them the video. They don't really need anything other than what's presented on the paper. Quick way to assess how they're doing. Now, this is one of the freebie activities. This is a cloze activity. I love these. There are so many different ways to use these. And if you have your paper, you can look along with me and make notes if you would like. But these activities can be formative, they can be summative. You can do it as a whole class. You can do it each student by themselves at their computer with headphones, which is very easy to do now, which is a benefit for them too, because they can stop, they can rewind, they can go forward. When you're doing a formative assessment with listening, you want to allow them to be able to do all of that so that later they'll be able to do it without stopping and pausing. It'll become easy. The only thing is you can't slow it down. So sometimes the kids can figure out how to slow down a video or add subtitles to it. Those are the only things that you really can't let them do, because part of the standards is communicating with a normal French situation, eventually with somebody in French where they can understand you and you'll understand them, and you can't slow someone or something down later. So you want to get them used to that now. So they can pause if you allow them to do it on your own. They can pause it, they can go forward, they can go backwards. That's why the times are listed here, because then they know, okay, for the first 20 seconds, I'm listening for 2 words. And then they can do the next 10 seconds, or one more time, I'm listening for 2 words. It really guides them into being able to focus their attention on one sentence with one word that's missing. So as a formative assessment, I have them watch the video and fill in the blanks, as I mentioned, either on their own, or we can do it together. That type of activity, though, is a little bit more difficult as a group activity because they can't stop it and rewind. I also enjoy, I just did an assessment like this. I play the video, but they can't see the video. They're just listening. And when they're listening, they're following along with the transcription and they try to fill in the words. For me, something that's very important, and I tell them the first time you hear it, it's going to seem very fast. You're going to feel like you can't do it, you don't know it, you just missed 3 blanks. It's okay. Go to the 4th one. And then if you're writing down your answer for the 4th one and you miss until the 8th one, that's okay. Just get what you can as you can. And then I always play it at least 3, 4 times so that they'll see, once they start focusing and listening to sounds and words and looking at what is presented for them, it becomes easier. And then when I go over the answers with them, they're always so excited when they say, "Oh, I got that one right." Because they were nervous. They didn't think they were going to be able to do it. They're surprised. They feel good about themselves afterwards. I walk them through it and I say, it's going to seem fast. It's okay. If you only get 1 the first time, that's okay. We're going to keep doing it. And then just look for more as you go. Sometimes what I have them do is go through and right before the end, when we're almost done with the activity, just go through and focus on the ones that you have and put a check mark next to it if you're confident, you're sure that one's okay. And then one more time through, don't focus on those ones, focus on the ones that are missing and see if you can identify those now. And then once we're done with the activity, as long as it's not a summative assessment, I give it back to them. I let them have it. They have access to the video and they can listen to it and read along to help them with the intonations or the pronunciation or the sentence structure. And then they can use that as their resource for the rest of the unit. Summative assessments you can also do with the students watching their own video on their own computer with their own headphones. There are a couple of programs, I know with Edulastic you can do that. We use Google Classroom. We can put the video in there so that each student can open it from their own computer. So once we decide if a student's doing it by himself, do I want him to be able to stop it and rewind? Okay, yes, that's okay. Or no, you can't do that. You're just going to listen. It's what makes sense for you. What do you need at that moment? And then the paper that I wanted to put in there for a free download here is I put together all of the activities and all of the standards and how each activity meets a standard. And I pulled some from that paper and I have them here for you to see. However, the resource sheet, you need to, in order to get that, you need to request it in your email at the end of the webinar. So here are some of the targets though. With this close activity that we just discussed, you can see that they are able to comprehend predictable vocab. We know what's coming. Okay? These are words that we use. If I'm watching the video, I can use that visual to help me, or even my background knowledge. Okay? Understand connected sentences and paragraph like discourse. These are standards that we need to help them achieve. Rely on visual support and background knowledge. That one was in there twice. Comprehend meaning through context clues. And then moving on then from that listening activity, I'm looking now at the interpersonal speaking. Interpersonal speaking just means there are two people. You have an opportunity to ask questions or to correct yourself if you make a mistake. Those are skills that are only in the interpersonal speaking. You can ask for clarification. So here, this one says interpersonal. If we look at the instructions, so they're going to look at a website and discuss it. What can you say about it? Can you talk about the pictures or the history, the architecture? What do you like? What do you not like? What did you learn? You could also turn that into presentational speaking or writing, or interpersonal writing with an email. I hope you're seeing a pattern that the units and the lessons are so flexible. So what do you need to get out of it? Having an interpersonal speaking is one of the most difficult skills, I think, to focus on. So sometimes I have them do both. I prepare it as a writing so they can gather their thoughts together and then talk about it with a partner after they've already put all of their information together. That way they're not trying to do it on the spot if they can't. All right, interpersonal speaking This one, it's so important, and it's listed in the lesson. Tell the students, don't rush through the questions. The objective here is not to answer all 9 questions. The objective is to have a conversation. Our objective is communication. So if the question takes you somewhere other than in the direction of the next question, right, go with it. See where it takes you. And as long as you are talking in French about the subject, then you're good. Right? And they need to elaborate. That's a big part of the standards as well. Can you keep something going? Can you add on to it? Or ask somebody a follow-up question, for example. I always tell them, don't let the questions slow you down or get in the way of your conversation. Ask a question, talk about it, and then see where it goes. And then once again, I have the standards here that interpersonal. This allows you to express your own thoughts. Okay? It allows you to show that you did learn something. You can compare your culture and theirs. And I try within the units, I've tried to move out of Paris. Everyone wants to go to see the Eiffel Tower. That's true. Everyone's very familiar with that. Well, not necessarily already familiar with, but that tends to be the target in a French classroom, is to talk about the Parisian monuments. I like to look at something that's a little different, like this one here, this monument that's in the southern part of France. If they're not seeking this information out, or if I'm not seeking it out, then they're most likely not going to stumble upon it. So I like to give them something that's a little different as well. And then they can follow those same steps of vocab and then comprehension and then main idea, and going all the way to those um, higher order thinking skills. Now, I do want to switch then to the PDF for the interpretive reading that I pulled that you can download, because there's so much to it. It was going to be difficult for all of us to follow along with it if it's in the presentation. So I just need 1 second. Oh no. Okay, are we there? I hope so. So here I'm looking at, this is the reading activity that you can download, and you have the keyword, as I mentioned before, where you want to show them, you want to guide them into the direction of what they'll need to finish the activities, the rest of the activities. Supporting details. These will always have some that are not in the text. So when they're looking for an answer to something and they can't find it, I tell them odds are then it's not in there. You want to put an X in that, and that shows me that you do understand what you're talking about or what you're reading about, because if you know that the answer is not in there, then I know you're understanding. At the lower levels, the organizational features and the author's purpose all seem to be easier, but when they get to the higher levels, French 2, 3, or 4, they need to know how to do that, and this is the base of that right now. This is still us teaching them the base knowledge where eventually in the future it'll be easier for them. At the level that I teach with the middle school students, I do find that sometimes I have to tell them what the organizational feature means, like autobiography, they might not know. Chronological, sometimes I find that students say it has a date in it, so it must be chronological. That's an important one that I stop and I tell them how they want to describe it. And guessing meaning from context is so important. And I always have students who look at the French word and say, I think that looks like pie. And so they'll just write down pie for A. And no, I tell them you need to take that, put it back into the context. We do the same thing in English. What does it mean? What are they talking about? And eventually they get it. But we practice that throughout the entire year and really get into using your same reading skills from English and using them in the French language as well. So if you want to use this in your classroom and with the inference question here, why do you think the picture was chosen to be put on the website? Or what might be that effect of it? It does say in English, you can answer them in English as I mentioned before, but if you're ready, you might want to, in levels 2 or 3, get them to answer those higher order thinking questions in French as well. There will always be the same 3 options for the author's perspective. What is the purpose here? Are they teaching us something? Are they trying to get us to do something? Or are they just entertaining us? And there can be more than one answer. This goes back to me saying the textbook wants you to give this answer, but if what you said makes sense, then that's okay. I'm not telling you what you need to think. I'm just getting you to think about it. How do you get there? Prove to me that you're saying that it's both entertaining and informational. With comparing cultural perspectives, it does get a little bit more difficult because we are at that high level of thinking. It's important for the students to understand that when you're comparing, you can be comparing things that are the same as well as different. Okay, what are some similarities? And how does this compare to my life, my community? A community can be as big or small as you want it to be. So if I'm saying, how does it compare to the United States? Or I'm from Ohio, how does it compare to people from Ohio? Or get it even smaller, how about Northeast Ohio? Or how does this compare to your school? Okay, all the way down to your house. If you want to say this is how it compares to me, I you have to identify what that means. What are we comparing? It's very easy for the students to say, the French think this. And you can't do that because you can't prove that every French person thinks the same thing. So it's the idea of finding the community. Who are you trying to say? The people from this reading, okay, compared to my house. It has to be specific. And then the personal reaction is where we want to be. That's where we want to go. And that will always be listed as something to do in French. It's always listed on there because everything that you did in that activity is leading up to activity 9, the personal reaction. This is where I need to see that you understood. I'm going to pull up the document that I put together for meeting the standards so I can show you that as well. Okay, this is what I want to look at with you. I do have this document that you can get, that you can keep for yourself. You need to ask for it in the email at the end of the presentation. So all I did was I took everything that we've done, everything I've discussed with the IPA, the new standards, the units, the thematic units. I took all of that and I put it together to answer the question why. How does it fit? What am I going to do with this? Why should I use it? Starting with the essential questions through everything, you're looking at the interpretives. These are the skills or the standards that I'm meeting with keyword recognition. If my teacher if my principal needs a I can statement, I can take it right from this page and say, I'm asking the students to give me the main idea. The I can statement is going to be, I can rely on vocabulary to derive meaning of a text. It's easy. You can pull it out of there to justify all activities that you're doing in class. It helps you focus your attention as well with supporting details. It can be as simple as I can identify supporting details because that's one of the standards. I can skim and scan. You don't always need to focus on the same skill, on the same standard with every activity that you do. Once you get into the higher order thinking skills, the activities with inferences, for example, this is where we want to be. We want them to be able to make inferences or show that they understand something by putting it together. We can have identifying the supporting details and understanding the main idea, but what can they do with it? They can say, I can reflect some knowledge of cultural differences, everything that I just learned, and relate it to writing or speaking. So I can take all of the input and have output to communicate. So I have all of these. I also did the same thing for fill in the blank activities, such as the closed listening activity, multiple choice activities. What they are also important in the classroom. What do they do? Presentational, interpersonal. And then finally, when they do say, well, we're not teaching grammar, we are teaching grammar. You still need to have a base of how do you form a sentence? How do you answer a question with a complete sentence? How do you make adjectives agree? They need to know that. Students still need to know that. So when you have a pop-up grammar lesson, if you need that justification or that I can statement, we have those too. Whatever comes up in the pop-up grammar, you can pull a standard from that as well. So yes, we do need to still teach grammar. It's just not the focus of every day class. So that's all I have prepared. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll stay here for a while longer. That way, if you do have questions, I can help answer them. If you need to email me instead, you can message me. I think there's a Q&A message if you want it to be private. Don't forget to take the lessons, the listening lesson and the reading lesson. And of course, that speaking one. They're all easy to put into a curriculum. They're ready-made, ready to go. And thank you too for listening and being interested and being here. When you go to get your certificate of completion, when you write that email, that's when you can ask for the standards sheet, how each activity meets the standards, or which standards each activity meets. Some of my favorite higher level thematic units are the communication ones with learning about social media and text messages. If you have some upper level classes, those ones are fun. Don't forget that if you are using them in the upper level, you just want to change where it says in English to in French, and it works. I also like to use the holiday one throughout the year, so I don't use it as a unit in its entirety at one point. I split it up and teach them when those holidays come up. And oftentimes, if there are two activities, like two reading, Christmas, then I'll do one with one level and then the other with the other level, like to change it up. Does anyone have any more questions? I'm happy to help and answer any questions. Once again, thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to share my perspectives. Have a good evening.